world's greatest weapon. No matter the conflict or the time period, one repulsive characteristic almost all conflicts share is the use of famine as a tool of war. This horrible reality must be encountered no matter the cost, because it has killed an uncountable number of people in one of the most cruel ways possible. No pain is greater than that of a person starving slowly, dying of great hunger that is only curable with food. To fix such a problem, we must first understand its history and how it has evolved, or rather, its lack of evolution. Weaponized hunger and using hunger as a weapon of mass death and destruction has been and always will be an extremely crude idea and process. This cycle of death cannot continue on for longer and must be thwarted soon. It has been repeated so many times, the world is permanently scarred by the effects of weaponized famine. What is famine? Famine is defined as a scarcity of food. The famine I'm going to be talking about is famine caused by warfare and famine being used as a weapon of war. History of famine and warfare. The use of famine as a weapon of war dates back to 2200 BCE. Sadly, it is still in use because of the undeniable usefulness in warfare. This is because no matter the tactics, military strength, or bravery of the soldiers, a nation cannot fight exhaustion caused by lack of food. This is a solid fact. An example of this is how Germany was forced to concede defeat because the people of Germany were starving from an Allied blockade of Germany during the Great War of World War One. The power of famine as a weapon of war can really be understood once you know that the German Empire signed an armistice and eventual treaty while they still occupied parts of France. I believe that if Germany had not agreed and the Allies had attempted to give a last push into Germany, the German people would have fought harder than the Allies could take and they would have a much more favorable treaty outcome, even though the casualty rate would have exceeded 3 million soldiers just for Germany. The amount of Germans that were at risk of starvation because of the famine is much higher and much more daunting. Civilian deaths are a greater tragedy to society and governments and are considered war crimes. The Allies' use of famine as a weapon of war during the Great War cannot be justified but must be recognized as a great contributing factor to the outcome of the Great War for both sides. Sadly, this topic has received little attention along with the Armenian genocide. That has made so history has repeated itself numerous times in the last 100 years, much to the detriment of civilizations and cultures around the world. So far, because of lack of media attention that this grave issue receives, the world has not learned from its mistake, and its continued use is prevalent no longer in Europe, but in places like Yemen. Famine, industrialization, warfare, and technology. As nations industrialize and develop technology, warfare will too. When you combine technology with famine, you get mass genocide on a scale unheard of in the current century. As more and more third world countries modernize and develop, the body count generated by this new style of warfare, a mix of old and new tactics, a new monster will be born, a monster of our own creation. Warfare is nowhere as simple as it's cut out to be. It involves multiple divisions of labor. First, you acquire an army of loyal, willing participants. History has proven that conscript armies will always be extremely inferior to volunteer and professional armies on the basis of morale. Morale is affected by a number of important things. First of all, health. This can include mental health and physical health, and whether the soldier is well fed and rested. This affects the soldier on such a basic level that it deserves much thought. Purposely affecting the morale of an opposing army is an effective branch of warfare, and this key weapon in doing so is famine, a type of psychological warfare. In this context, there are often greater impacts on civilians. Between famine's profound effects on citizens and soldiers alike, it has just as important connection to the next division of warfare, logistics. These trends repeat over and over again, no matter where in the world you look again and again, you see conflict and famine going hand in hand. One type of warfare is scorched earth. This is where food and other logistical shortages in the army lead the soldiers to looting and commandeering civilian food and resources. This has a profound effect on the civilian population, as it causes more widespread food shortages and often famine. An example would be a scorched earth policy enacted by the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa, and that used by Germany while they retreated. They destroyed industry, burnt crops, and trashed villages. They caused suffering and death to their own civilians and those of the annexed states and enemy states, through indiscriminate killings and destruction of buildings with its inhabitants still inside. The Ukrainian famine. This was a man-made famine used by the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin to eliminate the Ukrainian independence movement. It killed between 3 and 12 million Ukrainians and millions of others across the Soviet Union. They were killed by man-made famine. The first case we are discussing is the 1932-33 Ukrainian famine, commonly known as Holodomor, derived from the Ukrainian words for hunger and extermination, holod and more. Is encompassed by the larger Soviet famine of 1931-34. It was a man-made famine started by the Soviet Union in the beginnings in their quest to collectivize and expand communism and their principles by deporting landowners and peasants off their land. This led to a wholly justified rebellion and the Ukrainians wishing for independence. Joseph Stalin responded by harshly cracking down on them through the placement of entire towns and areas on blacklists where they did not receive grain or any kind of food. They prevented them from receiving food as well as not allowing them freedom of movement from Ukraine, along with heightened amounts of food requisitions and denial of aid. This condemned a massive portion of Ukraine's population to death alongside those killed by the brutal repression and abuse meted out by Soviet police. This is without a doubt one of the worst famines in history, claiming the lives of an estimated 6 million citizens of Ukraine, who often had to resort to abandonment of their villages and cannibalism to stay alive. Famine in China. China has suffered arguably the worst out of any country in the world in terms of famine. Most of these deaths came from the Great Chinese Famine from 1959 to 61 that was caused by the Great Leap Forward. Communist China's campaign to quickly organize and centralize its vast population into large-scale agricultural communes to industrialize China. The Great Leap Forward was an extreme failure due to a great natural disaster and the forced conversion of equipment and industry to fit the required plans. This led to between 20 and 50 million deaths from 1959 to 61. The Great Chinese Famine is widely regarded as the worst famine in history, and rightly so, as every famine, man-made or otherwise, from the start of the First World War to the present does not equal the death toll of the Great Chinese Famine. This is when the death tolls of every other famine China has experienced from war, natural disaster, or other is discounted. The numbers are sobering. Famine in Vietnam. The Great Vietnam Famine of 1944-45 was caused by a number of natural disasters along with brutal repression by France as French Indochina. When the then Japanese occupation once France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940. This famine was extremely lethal, the estimated death toll being close to 2 million of a population of 20 million. It is simply astounding. The degree of suffering is worth, if not on par with genocides and famines of the 30s and 40s. But even this horrible event will cast into the shadows of an even greater tragedy, that of America's war in Vietnam. The numbers are simply astounding. During the entirety of the war, about 58,000 Americans would perish. The death toll for Vietnam was around 57 times that number. An estimated 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers were killed, while the North Vietnamese suffered 1.1 million military deaths. The most staggering number is over 2 million civilians who perished as a result of massacres, famines, and other disasters caused by the war. This includes but is not limited to destruction of crops, forested areas, and houses by the spraying of Agent Orange and bombings. When it comes to famine, though, Agent Orange is really the worst offender. Its function is defoliation or to cause widespread loss of leaves that kills the plant. The U.S. Army used Agent Orange to great efficiency, spraying 12 million gallons of Agent Orange during the war to take away the advantage given to the North Vietnamese soldiers by the jungle. The downside to the use of Agent Orange is the millions of acres of land destroyed and rendered useless. The Syrian War. Much like the plight of other Middle Eastern countries, the continuous fighting of the civil war and constant airstrikes by a number of belligerents have destroyed key infrastructure. This pushes the people out of the city where they flee to other countries. This causes serious problems for that country that then sends them back where they continue to starve. Millions of displaced Syrians are victims of famine, and shortages of other precious resources needed for life. This must be addressed as it is a serious crime to ignore these people in their time of need. South Sudan. Being the world's youngest nation does not help South Sudan in any way. They have a continuous civil war since 2013 that has led to around 400,000 deaths. It also led to the displacement of millions and the destruction of key infrastructure needed to keep the population of South Sudan fed, as well as destruction of government order and any sort of steady housing or steady food sources, as well as humanitarian aid is slow to be implemented because of the dangers posed to such persons, as at least 100 have been killed since 2013. Yemen. Because of a combination of political instability, civil war, and economic problems, millions of civilians of Yemen are at serious risk of death by starvation. Constant combat and airstrikes and bombings have turned their country into a war zone. This destruction forces people to flee in all directions, creating even more displaced persons as the direction of combat inches closer. As well, the destruction of important infrastructure creates great supply problems, as aid is having trouble reaching the two-thirds of the population of Yemen that is in need of some serious humanitarian aid. Change is possible. There are many There are many. The great problem definitely can be solved. Change is possible. There are many components that, when brought together, can fix the problem of famine being used as a weapon of war. The aftermath of the Second World War and how it has been taught has shown us clearly how to deal with these problems. Following the very effective strategies used to combat world problems, so that the tragedy of the Second World War can never be repeated. Potential solutions for ending famine caused by war, famine as a tool of war, are first and foremost begun with international intervention. This can happen in a few different ways. A few actions we can take are needing accountability and prosecution for mass starvation. It needs to be a crime. And another one is we need commitment to implement the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Bold action needed to end war, to end starvation, end war, famine, and mass starvation. We all need to get involved. Check out the resources such as World Peace Foundation, United Nations Security Council, and the UN Food Program. We can all make a difference, and maybe one day we will live in a world in which famine as a weapon of war is no longer reality. A world in which mass starvation and conflict are not inevitable, a world possible for each and every one of us.